Compañeros, welcome to the SQL Data Partners podcast, the podcast dedicated to SQL Server related topics, which is designed to help you become familiar with what's out there, how you might use those features or ideas on how you might apply them in your environments. I am Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am Steve Stedman. We are two data professionals trying to help others get a better handle on their database environments, either through this podcast, our training, or our consulting practice. Thanks for joining us on the SQL Trail. Welcome to the show.
SQL Data Partners.
Okay, Steve, welcome to episode 76.
Wow, 76. That's 26 episodes that I've been part of with this, Carlos. This is amazing.
Yeah, we're keep chugging right along.
Yeah.
And grateful for those who are giving us feedback, and we'd like to talk about or mention a couple.
Oh, yeah.
Really quick.
Yeah, I know we've been asking for feedback for a few weeks, and so I could all load it up today.
That's right. Things are either starting to get really busy for everybody for holidays or really slow, and they're managing to reach back out to us.
Yep.
One of those, Benjamin Quintanilla, mentions that he listens to the podcast while driving into work, and he actually wants us to do our podcast a bit more frequently. And so, Benjamin, of course, we are thinking about that. We've been kind of been tooling with that idea, but be patient with us, and we'll see what the new year brings.
Yep, and I think that's what we were talking about with our tuning review, to do that as a second episode occasionally. So,
no, exactly.
Another bit of feedback we got here was on the Zero to SQL book that you just completed.
Yes.
That note came from Jonna 2000 left the message, and I think that's someone who was on the show previously, I believe.
That's right. Episode 51. Yeah, so episode 51, the PowerShell story.
Yep. That comment said that the book, and this is referring to the Zero to SQL book, that it's oriented towards the aspiring IT professional or student trying to foray into the database world with no prior knowledge of databases. This book is a great introduction with easy to understand examples that are applicable to any version of SQL Server. It starts out with the basic concept and keeps it simple throughout for the beginner, which is kind of cool because that's really right on with what your target was, to build that first time Zero to SQL, or for someone who's used Zero SQL. I think that review hits right on with what your goal was.
Yeah, no, exactly. And thankful to Jonna and, of course, all the others who have given a little bit of feedback, either reviews on Amazon or just replying back to me personally through emails or with other support. I know on the Kindle edition, it looked like we had emails or with other support. I know on the Kindle edition, it looked like we had a little bit of formatting issues, which I'm looking to update or make right. And hopefully, maybe by the time this podcast comes out, or if not, particularly by the end of the year, by 2017, that will all be fixed. But thanks for those who've reviewed that, and I do appreciate it. So after listening to episode 74, Christopher reached out and said he heard about the story, my father being from Costa Rica and him and us going down there. He mentions he's from Punta Arenas, which is in Costa Rica, and wanted to connect and thanked us for doing the podcast. And so thanks, Christopher, for chiming in. And we'd like to say hello to all the other Ticos that might be listening. Ticos, that word is the kind of the name Costa Rican people have given themselves. That's how they refer to themselves. So.
Okay, great. And then while we're here recording this, I just got a message that popped in on my phone with some feedback.
Oh, wow.
And this came
from real-time feedback.
Well, when you popped in on my phone with some feedback.
Oh, wow.
And this came
real-time feedback.
Well, real time when we're recording. But this came in from a friend of mine, Andre Ranieri. And Andre is someone that I've known for several years now. I think I met him at one of the very first SQL Saturdays that I went to. And he left a comment referring to episode 73, which was with Pinal Dave. So he said he enjoyed the podcast with Pinal Dave. You guys should do a podcast on indexing, which is kind of cool because that's something we've actually been talking about doing and in the near future. So
that's right.
That sort of gives us a little bit motivation to go do that episode on indexing. So one of my favorite topics is indexes. Well, behind corrupt databases, of course.
Yeah, that's right. So that we'll put that on the calendar for 2017 as well.
Yep. So today's guest is Jimmy May. Jimmy also is someone I've known for a couple of years. We've crossed paths at several past events. and things like that related to
Right.
flash storage. So good stuff. He's a SQL Server technologist at SanDisk, which is a Western Digital brand.
Mhm.
And he has background previously working with Microsoft just before going to SanDisk. So definitely knows his stuff, and at least from what I can tell, around storage and flash specifically.
No, exactly. I think he's put out a couple of white papers on the subject, and in that storage area, very nice, very fun to talk to. You mentioned his presentations. He always has a kind of a different take on things and the way he does things, and I think that it'll be a real treat talking with him today.
Absolutely.
The URL link for today's episode will be at sqldatapartners.com/Jimmy. You can go there. We'll be posting up information about some of the things he gives us and other notes from today's episode there at sqldatapartners.com/Jimmy. So let's go ahead and get into the conversation with Jimmy. Other notes from today's episode there at sqldatapartners.com/Jimmy. So let's go ahead and get into the conversation with Jimmy. So Jimmy, welcome to the program.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, it's nice of you to come out. Always interesting to talk to former Microsoft folks, guys who have worked on the SQL Cat team. Lots of experience under your belt. And so thanks for coming and being willing to share a little bit of your time with us.
Oh, sure. Thanks.
And I know I've seen Jimmy present a couple times, and I've always had a great time learning along the way. So hopefully we'll have that same experience today.
Crossing our fingers.
And one last thing, just to butter this bread a little bit more, one of the nicest people, I think, in the SQL community, always willing to talk, kind of get some feedback or share thoughts, opinions with those at conferences, SQL Saturdays, what have you. And so if you ever get a chance to go up and say hi to Jimmy, take advantage of it because you won't regret the time.
I really appreciate that, guys.
Ultimately, what we want to talk about tonight is we want to talk about your experience that you had in putting together an availability group and trying to understand some of the pain points that customers are experiencing, and then trying to figure out how to get around those pain points and kind of putting the proof in the pudding, if you will, as some of the advancements in SQL Server 2016.
Oh, well, I'm glad you asked.
Yeah, so let's go ahead and dive into that. Give us a quick recap of kind of that, how you put that together, and then we'll dig into what you found.
Okay, well, the goal was to, as you stated, we wanted to put together an availability group architecture that was actionable, not just, we weren't just trying to set super high world record numbers, but something we could toss over the transom for an arbitrary customer to read and implement. And along the way, and of course, as you know, I work for a company that sells a lot of Flash, and I've been a big fan of flipping the faster bit ever since even before I was a member of SQL Cat. And so that was a big part of the picture. And there are some challenges, even on Flash, with regard to storage, latency, things like that. And we have a handful of lessons learned. We proved out the really exciting log transport improvements that were a bottleneck in availability groups in 2012 and 2014. No longer we get that data across the wire in a near real time. However, there's still some issues with the log redo at the high end performance. And along the way, also implemented some other findings. The -K startup trace flag, which is something that virtually any installation can take care of. That's we'll go into it more in detail, I hope, later. But
right.
We have a startup trace flag, fully supported, not well documented, to throttle checkpoints, and at a level that
You wanted to use availability groups, and you wanted synchronous commits.
Absolutely.
From the primary to both secondaries.
Yeah. The setup itself was largely pretty vanilla, and we did that by design. If the only quote-unquote exotic pieces were some of the hardware components to make sure we didn't run into bottlenecks. But we had 3 2U boxes, HP 380, DL380 G9s. Our friends wouldn't like us to call them commodity boxes. They're super fantastic and amazingly performant, but they were off-the-shelf boxes.
Sure.
2 sockets. We used Broadwell processors. Also started out with Haswells, but the project, during the duration of the project, we upgraded. 256 gigs of RAM, nothing crazy. And we had some pretty high network throughput. It didn't come close to hitting the bandwidth, though. We had, for availability, we put in 2 Mellanox NICs, 40 gigabits apiece, and we teamed those using standard Windows teaming. Pretty simple to set up and configure, something which heretofore I had not had a standard, though. We had, for availability, we put in 2 Mellanox NICs, 40 gigabits apiece, and we teamed those using standard Windows teaming. Pretty simple to set up and configure, something which heretofore I had not had a whole lot of experience, but turns out to be very easy to set up. And even a non-network geek could do it with relative ease. So we had a total aggregated bandwidth of 80 gigabits if we wanted to use it. And that would serve us well. We wanted to put together multiple AGs, availability groups.
Sure.
And what else can I tell you? Oh, the data, of course, the storage, the stars of the show. We used Flash doesn't come in just, a lot of us are used to seeing what used to be Fusion IO, PCIe cards, right? Well, Flash comes in 2.5-inch standard small form factor flavor now. And what we did was we started out with 8, decided to end up with 10 2.5-inch disks. And a Flash, only 800 gigabytes apiece, relatively small. They also come in a 1.6 gigabyte flavor, 4 terabytes, and very, very soon we're coming out with 8 terabyte disks. But anyway, these were a total of 10 800 gigabyte disks, and we use 6
inserted right into the box.
Right into the box. Yeah, that's one of the amazing things about these commodity, quote-unquote commodity servers off the shelf. A variety of OEMs, including HP, make these boxes with 24 slots. Not a special order. You just say, hey, I want the box with 24 2.5-inch slots in the front, and you get it. And so think about that. You put 4 terabyte disks in there. You've got 96 terabytes of raw storage. You put the new 8 terabyte disks in there. You've got almost 200 terabytes of raw storage in a box that's about as big as 2 pizza boxes. It's amazing. It's really amazing. And you've got the new processors from Intel. It's just amazing. You have CPU to drive that capacity and the performance. Okay. Anyway, but we use 6 800 gig disks for the data and 4 800 gig disks for the log.
And then it's all yours, right? You don't have to share those disks.
That's correct. Non-shared storage. All mine. All yours.
I'm just listening to you describe that. I'm just thinking about configurations we have where we have shared storage or a bunch of virtual machines sharing the same hardware. And I'm just thinking the configuration you've got there is certainly going to be way more performant than what I typically see.
Sure.
No question about it. Well, wait till I start talking about the performance numbers. Again, a guy who's has dedicated his career to flipping the faster bit. We got some latencies that were so low that I had to double check the math. But we'll get into that later, hopefully.
Wow. Okay, so I guess let's go back and now kind of set the stage for some of the pain points that you managed to resolve or that we'll talk about. And so ultimately, back and now kind of set the stage for some of the pain points that you managed to resolve or that we'll talk about. And so ultimately, and again, in our podcast, we want to make sure that we kind of set a level playing field, and we're going to try to explain some of these concepts. So with the availability group, you have a server, you're setting it to synchronous commit, meaning you have a second server. The transaction has to write to the first server, send it to the second, commit on the second, get a reply back, and then the transaction is complete.
Exactly. But we had 3 replicas, not just 2, or 1 primary, 2 secondary. So we actually had to get this ACK from 2 servers.
Okay.
Before we proceeded.
Right. And the ACK meaning an acknowledgement.
Yes. Before the data could be hardened on or committed on back on the primary log.
Right. And so one of the pain points we have, which you referenced, is just the log transport. So not only are we as 6 writes, right? 1 for the data, 1 for the log, and then on 3 servers. Okay.
Well, the way it works in terms of the AGs is the log is flushed from the primary database. This is on let's call this the main server, the primary server, and the data is flushed to the availability group's logs. In this case, we had a simple 1 database AG. Okay, and the data on that log is what is shipped across the wire. It's received by the secondary AG logs, and then it's applied to the replica data files on that side.
Gotcha.
So then when it's applied on that side, then that causes the write to the data file appropriately.
Exactly.
And then that log gets saved as the local log file. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's a local log file, and so on failover, for example, that log file becomes the primary log file.
Yep.
The secondary, the recovery queue is emptied. The secondary is the AG does a little bit of internal manipulation to say, I'm preparing myself to be there, and the user transactions transpire there, just like it did originally on the primary.
Yep. So then you mentioned some enhancements with SQL Server 2016 around that process of getting the logs transported and then logs redone on that end.
Oh, we were so pleasantly surprised. As early as far back as CTP1, we were seeing these enormous performance improvements of getting the data across the wire. So you see, historically, and this is part of the hashtag it just runs faster. SQL 2016, a lot of amazing performance improvements have been implemented. I am so truly, again, this is Jimmy May, former Microsoft employee, former member of the product team, but third party now, okay? So I can say this with complete impartiality. Huge fan of what the SQL Server product team has done. Is SQL Server 2012 is when AGs were introduced, and there was a bottleneck. It was tragic. AGs were pretty cool. Basically, 12 is when AGs were introduced, and there was a bottleneck. It was tragic. AGs were pretty cool conceptually, an enhancement of database mirroring, but we were limited to 40 or 50 megabytes per second across the wire, no matter what hardware you had. No matter how many CPUs, no matter how much memory, no matter how broad your network pipe was, there was a hard-coded bottleneck built into availability groups. It was a vestige of the database mirroring code, buried very deeply in the bowels of it. When this code was written way back when, there was no hardware in the world that required the kind of throughput that you could get 4 or 5 years ago, and certainly not today.
Sure.
And so SQL Server 2012 and 2014, there was this hardwired bottleneck that you just could not work around. No ifs, ands, or buts. 40 to 50 megabytes per second. In 2016, they unleashed the hounds. We get without no special tuning, same server hardware. You just use a different version. In fact, I've got a white paper. You guys need to, as part of the podcast, need to publish the link to it that has documentation for all this and what I hope is a very lucid presentation. And the appendices are amongst the most valuable pieces of the white paper. You've got the usual yada yada in the body of the paper. The appendices have some of the very interesting findings that a perf geek like me and like you guys would be interested in, including charts comparing head-to-head matchups of SQL Server 2014 log transport versus 2016. Again, just changing the version of the software, version of SQL Server on the same hardware. We went from that 40 or 50 megabytes per second up to a quarter of a gigabyte. Boom. And that genuinely expands the scope of applications that are suitable. Even warehouse workloads, ETL, you can, any kind of index maintenance, etc. It was easy to hit that bottleneck in 2012 and 2014. And the problem, let me back up a little bit. The problem with this bottleneck isn't just that you're bottlenecked and you can only get 50 megabytes per second across the wire. That while that data is being generated on the primary application, it's queued up on the primary, bottlenecked, waiting to get across the wire, waiting to get, inserted into the log transport mechanism. And if something happens to that primary, you've lost data. I mean, it's possible you can regenerate it depending on your application, but at a fundamental level, that data is gone.
Sure.
And that's not a formula for high availability. Whereas now, easily up to 250 megabytes per second, and with a little tuning, you can get more, is in real time, sent across the wire via the log transport mechanism, hardened on the secondary logs in real time. It's just amazing. And so on failover, boom, the data's there, no data loss. So it's not only do we have better performance, you've got better HA and NDR. Okay, so that's the log transport. Okay, so that's the log transport mechanism.
Right.
Now, do you want me to dive into another aspect of the AG log-related stuff?
Sure.
Yeah, I think we're going to talk about log redo.
Yes, exactly. So there are two. We've just been talking about the log transport and the exciting performance improvements that 2016 gave us. Log redo is the other piece of the availability group, log-related mechanisms that is required for the process to work properly. And the log redo is simply a continuous restore process. Your data that's shoveled across the wire is hardened on that secondary log, and then via a redo process, it's applied to the constituent secondary replica database files. This is something you alluded to a little while ago, Steve. And nothing too exotic about it, just a continuous restore process. The challenge here, though, is at the high performance levels we were generating, the redo can't keep up. Now, the team, SQL 2016 team did a great job. They've turned it into a parallel process. So that helps, but it still just can't keep up. And so at the maximum kind of levels we were doing, the redo was falling behind. And and that's not a formula for true high availability. Disaster recovery, yes, but in the event of failover, if the recovery queue on the secondaries are building up, when you do try to fail over, that recovery queue's got to empty before the server is actually available to accept transactions. Now, the good news is, at this point, there aren't very many applications that require the kind of throughput we were throwing. And again, it's pretty impressive. These 2 U boxes, 2 sockets, 2 CPUs, a little bit of flash, workload generator, throwing 250 megabytes per second across the wire. Now, how many applications require that kind of performance? Well, not that many, frankly, today.
Sure.
Even a lot of the tier 1 apps I used to work for, it's issue, and they're actively working on it. So unlike the log transport issue, which took them 2 versions of SQL Server to remediate, this issue, which is, again, not a problem for hardly anybody in the world today, it was likely to be remediated relatively medium term before it becomes a problem for the world, for your day-to-day application.
So then just to recap, to make sure I understand that bit, if you're pushing the data through on the log transport at up to that 0.25 gigabyte per second, then your log redo queue is going to fill up on the secondary side and get backlogged to the point that it may take a while to catch up when you fail over.
Exactly correct. Good summary. Very pithy there. I wish I could be that pithy. And so the log just continues. The recovery queue just continues to grow at these high performance, at these high rates of performance. Most high performance applications aren't going to get even close to that kind of a throughput, and applications aren't going to get even close to that kind of a throughput. And you're going to be okay. But this is a theoretical limit. It's really interesting, though. Again, I mentioned the appendices in this white paper we just published. The appendices has this in detail. It actually shows some of the internals, how you can interrogate it, look at what's going on in the secondary replica, etc., to see for yourself what's going on.
And we'll have to include the links to that in the podcast notes.
Good.
That's right. Which will be at SQLDataPartners.com/Jimmy.
Bada bing.
All right, so on to another topic. I know you mentioned the -K startup flag. Can you maybe jump into that a little bit and what you've found there?
Okay. This is one of the most exciting takeaways of this work. I know during our podcast lead-in, when we were level setting, I asked if you guys had heard about it. And the truth is, very, very few people have heard about it. I first heard about the -K startup trace flag in SQL skills training during immersion IE01 with Paul, Kim, Jonathan, Aaron, Tim, Glenn, etc. Recently.
I was going to say, I managed to look it up on the MSDN, and it's not listed on the engine services startup options.
It is fully supported, and it has been, believe it or not, since 2005.
Wow.
So we need to get that fixed. You know what? That'd be a great connect item, wouldn't it?
There you go.
It is hard to find documentation. In fact, when I was first, I remember using it. I was involved as a third-party person, post Microsoft. I was invited by the CAT team to come in and assist with a lab about a year ago. And I saw this implemented in real life with one of these tier 1 customers that do crazy cutting edge stuff. And my friend Arvind, one of the first MCMs in 2008, was implementing it with this tier 1 customer. And I got to see. It's something that I'm pretty sure a lot of places that need cutting edge performance are going to start adopting. And here's why. Even in conventional shops, as a consultant for Microsoft services, 10 years or more so ago, my old day job with a big fast database, when a checkpoint occurs, we didn't talk about it. We talked about -K. What is -K? It throttles the checkpoint to a user-defined level. Many of us who have any experience at all with I/O are familiar with the checkpoint spikes that occur. The dirty pages in the buffer pool, SQL Server at times sufficiently often to keep the database recovery on failover to be Again, by failover, I mean on restart, I should say,
Up to date.
independent of availability groups. Now, this dash K is important not just for availability groups, but for any standalone SQL Server instances that experience challenges with checkpoints overwhelming their lone SQL Server instances that experience challenges with checkpoints overwhelming their disk I/O subsystem. And it's very, very common. We've seen it for years, and these challenges can go anywhere from a spike when the dirty pages get flushed to disk to a stalagmite, a little bit of a pyramid, to whole plateaus. The checkpoint basically never finishes, and so 5, 10, 20 millisecond latencies for spinning media, 1 or 2 millisecond latencies for flash, can suddenly turn into 100 millisecond, 500 millisecond latencies for an arbitrarily long period of time, and it just hammers performance. And plus, you've got inconsistency problems. You're suddenly the whole system during the duration of the checkpoint throttles the entire system.
Right.
So in our case, for example, during the default behavior, without implementing -K, we were getting, without checkpoints, 99,000 transactions per second. During checkpoints, we were getting only 49,000 transactions per second. And so so if you looked at the chart in the white paper, you'll see what looks like literally a roller coaster. Just high, woof, high, woof.
Sure.
So it's quite a ride, but it's not something that your users want or your system wants. Implementing -K, and you just implement it simply by adding it like a trace flag like any other, followed with no space by an integer representing the number of megabytes per second of checkpoint throughput you want SQL Server to provide, but no more. And in our case, the sweet spot, we did several tests. In our case, the sweet spot was 750. -K 750 said, hey, SQL Server, I don't care how many dirty pages you have, never shove more than 750 megabytes per second down at my disks. And doing so allowed this roller coaster ride, and manifested by the default behavior we all know and hate, to a remarkable, flat, consistent performance. Checkpoint pages per second are throttled at that 750 megabytes per second, and that allows the system, and because you define it, you do a little bit of testing, you define the sweet spot, and suddenly CPU is basically flat. Your transactions per second are basically flat. Log flushes per second are basically flat and consistent. And the great news is that not only do you get consistent behavior, but the average is far higher than the average of that roller coaster ride. So, yeah, I'm telling you, I posted the paper when it was published to the MCM distribution list, and I had several comments back about it. Oh, where has this been all my life? Kind of stuff. And so I think you'll start to be seeing some adoption. So again, one of the biggest takeaways of this availability group paper is, in time I've ever seen it documented anywhere, the outcome of the impact of the -K startup trace flag.
Sure. When we start talking about trace flags, one of the things we want to at least make sure that we understand the downside, or at least why it's not enabled by default. It may be a good reason, a good thought. And if I think about it, it's really then what you're going to potentially increase. Again, kind of your mileage may vary depending on what your size is and whatnot, is that when that instance restarts, you may have to go through more of those redo logs to get back. Is that a fair assessment?
That's a good guess.
Okay.
That's a very good guess. But first of all, let me be clear. This -K isn't directly related to anything involving availability groups. It's basically.
Well, I guess I said redo log, but I meant the log, right? So you're going through the log, and it has to apply. It has to move the transaction forward or back.
Right. It's basically.
Well, I guess I said redo log, but I meant the log, right? So you're going through the log, and it has to apply. It has to move the transaction forward or back.
Right. So you could do a -K that is too low. And you basically get a sustained checkpoint that never actually ever finishes, and that's what we did. And seriously, and you would run into exactly that situation. The recovery on database restart, on server restart, would take far longer than you want. But it turns out by doing when I refer to the sweet spot, part of the sweet spot means not just limiting the value so that it's below a limit that the disk I/O system can sustain in terms of how many dirty pages it can take per second. But also, you want that checkpoint, you want that number to be sufficiently high so you don't run into that situation where you restart the database and it takes forever to recover.
Right.
And so that is a potential downside. Very, very astute, because we didn't talk a lot about this beforehand. So I'm impressed that you came up with that. But the reality is, with the right, just a little bit of testing, I mean, we tested it thoroughly, and it took less than a day.
Sure.
And half a day probably. And we get a number that is, again, so the recovery is normal. You can restart the database, in a few seconds. Yet we're not overwhelming the disk I/O subsystem.
Right.
And you asked a question, you or Steve, of why isn't this on by default? That's something I hadn't thought of, but the answer came immediately to my mind. The SQL Server product team, by its nature, they do things conservatively. They first do no harm, etc. And
Sure.
it's like trace flags 1117 and 1118. How long have we wondered, why aren't these the default? Why don't they create 8 TMDB files or 4, whatever, by default? Well, they were conservative, right? They finally realized, in 2016, they said finally be by default. It's a known bottleneck. It's been a best practice for years for users to implement it. We're going to save them the trouble and finally make it the default, even though it's been a best practice for 3, 4, 6 versions. Who knows?
Right.
I'd have to think really hard to know how far back we'd have to go to discover when they were introduced. So I think it's kind of like that, especially as Flash becomes more and more a predominant host for SQL Server data and log files. And with these crazy performance we're able to provide by contemporary servers, it's a shame that people are going to have to resort to suffer needlessly. That's really what it amounts to, with the absence, with the default checkpoint behavior. So it wouldn't surprise me if in some subsequent version of SQL Server, we see that implemented by default.
Yep.
Sure.
However, though, you'd still need to have a way to adjust it to fit your specific environment, even if there was a default for it, I would assume.
No question.
Yep.
That's going to be, maybe SQL Server.
However, though, you'd still need to have a way to adjust it to fit your specific environment, even if there was a default for it, I would assume.
No question.
Yep.
That's going to be, maybe SQL Server is going to be smart enough, because, first do no harm. It would be easy to implement a default that in some cases could be harmful. You're right, though, Steve. Absolutely. Yeah. But SQL Server is getting smarter all the time. And so who knows what they'll think of next.
Okay. So on that, then, how about any other best practices that you learned while you were going through this process of building this out and testing it?
Oh man, I could go on. Let me at least give me time for 2, please.
Okay.
hopefully we have more. The 2 next most important ones, I think, are hardware validation. And again, this is independent of AGs. This is independent of SQL Server 2016. It's been long been a best practice as a geek parachuting in to cities all over the planet for Microsoft's consulting services. I evangelized. Validate your hardware. Have a problem? You're in trouble.
Yeah.
Seriously, that problem's not going to get fixed very easily, and no one's going to be happy about it. So the time to validate performance is before you put your hardware into production, whatever the hardware is, and especially storage. So the goal is I would say, when you buy new hardware, you need to hit 2 different thresholds. One, you need to hit the specs that are documented, that you can download, publicly available, etc., from whoever your vendor is. The second one is make sure you hold the sales geeks' feet to the fire for that vendor. Make sure that the promises they made, you're able to hit. And if you can't hit them, get their people in there until you do. And so circling back to the work that we did, we were struggling, as we comply with our own best practices, believe it or not. The cobbler's kids have shoes in my shop.
Very good.
Yeah. And I wasn't able to hit the numbers I needed. I said, what? Here are the specs? Oh, what's the specs? Oh, what's going on here? And I was consistently about 20% below what the nominal specs were. And we struggled for a couple, 3 days until we realized we had the wrong firmware on the SSDs. We were really scratching our heads and had to call in some bigger geeks than I am. And for the record, validating the hardware wasn't on my plate. It wasn't my job to do that.
Ooh. Someone else's job, but it's still your problem, right?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. But the point is, we discovered this not halfway into the hardcore testing and had to restart all the experiments. This was at a fundamental part in the work. We were pretty early on, and we got it done. And a takeaway from this is not merely, yes, validate your hardware, but also, and this is very important, this is Flash related, most of us don't upgrade the firmware or drivers for our spinning media. Okay, I certainly never have. Occasionally, when I ask my audience, I get a hand, yes, for our spinning media. Okay, I certainly never have. Occasionally, when I ask my audience, I get a hand, yes, we do. But no ifs, ands, or buts, no questions. Flash, like most of the other electronics in our servers, require updates, both the drivers and firmware. And make sure you have the latest and greatest. Test, trust but verify and all that, of course. But get your latest and greatest stuff out there. And I know from experience working with SanDisk and now Western Digital, and formerly Fusion IO, that stuff can make a big difference. So 2 takeaways there.
Very good.
One other one I want to throw out, you asked for what other takeaways I have. We have the luxury, working in an all-flash environment, of using crazy parameters to do our backups and restores. And we back up and restore multiple terabyte databases routinely, as a matter of course, in a matter of minutes. And it's pretty cool. Yeah, wow. Whereas environments I've worked in the past, as multiple terabyte database can literally take hours overnight, or just a matter of minutes. But we do this by modifying some long-time parameters that have been available to us in SQL Server for basically over a decade, since, a decade and a half, 2 decades. And they are the number of devices, max transfer size, and buffer count. And my historical default has been to use 8 devices for data files. Max transfer size, it maxes out, you can't make it more than 4 megabyte. The default is 64K. So that every request from a data file, the backup process will grab a 4 megabyte chunk, and instead of a 64K chunk, and also buffer count. And this is how much memory the backup processes are allowed to use. And the default varies, as I understand it, based on the hardware configuration that the database is on. But to maximize performance, backup performance, we multiply the number of logical cores times 4. This is something that my old buddy and mentor taught to implement. And a part of a real world scenario is doing backups. And we chose to implement our log backups every 5 minutes. And we needed to find values for both database backup and log backup that wouldn't impact the latency of the application. So instead of tuning for backup performance, we had to balance that with application performance, which is something I wasn't used to because I haven't been a production DBA for well over a decade now. And that was a lot of fun. So if you were to download the white paper, you would find that the parameters we used, I don't need to go into the details here, but used different parameters for the data files versus the log files. Easy to implement. But the point is, we did some of the work, heavy lifting for you, and provided a template that you could use to implement in your own installations. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. I would bet that probably 99% of the backups I see out there are just going with the defaults on those.
And it's tragic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Provided a template that you could use to implement in your own installations. Okay.
Yeah, that's great. I would bet that probably 99% of the backups I see out there are just going with the defaults on those.
And it's tragic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I know tragic is probably an overkill of a metaphor, but we are talking squandered resources. Okay. Yep.
Yeah, that's right.
So there we go.
Well, so Jimmy, thanks for coming on and chatting with us today. I know, that you're willing to take the pains and kind of take one for the team and then share it with us so that we can learn from your from your
Are you
experience.
kidding? This is the best job I've ever had in my life. I mean, SQL Cat was a lot of fun, but this job is just a blast in terms of. So I don't mind. If these are the kind of hits I have to take, fine, keep them coming.
Yeah, very good.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate the great work you guys do, and thank you so much for the invitation.
Not a problem. Will we do SQL Family?
Sure.
All right, so the first SQL Family question is on keeping up with technology. How do you go about keeping up with all the changes that are continuously happening? Besides writing white papers.
That's really a tough one, because the SQL Server is so broad and deep, and I don't, imposter syndrome. A lot of people are Gosh, I could go for 20 minutes on this. I am keenly aware of my deficits. They are broad and they are deep. Man, I just fake it till I make it. I'm candid at this point in my career. Can be candid with my deficits. And my buddy John Steerett, a shiny new MVP, he told me, I think it was John who's told me, if you stay one chapter ahead of your customer, you're an expert. So, so that's part of the secret. And the truth is, I'm actually taking a new month, quarter to quarter, year to year. I craft my goals, and one of the reasons I'm very excited about this December, I have a couple weeks, really hardcore weeks off. That between ski sessions. Ski days, I'm going to craft my vision statement. And that includes a hardcore plan, not just I'm going to read PowerShell in a month of lunches. I'm going to plot out when I'm going to do the chapters. Michael Fall, another shiny new MVP, highly recommended that book among other people. And also I've enrolled in and have just started the Microsoft Data Sciences professional curriculum.
Oh, yeah.
And my goal is to finish it by the end of December. So to answer your question, besides faking it till I make it, besides being candid, besides not buying into imposter syndrome, I live an intentional life and I plot out my goals. And one last thing, speaking of imposter syndrome, a dear, sweet, beautiful gem of a friend, Marilyn Grant, during a training session at Microsoft Consulting Services, said the following, and this is very important. It really helped me in my dark days when I thought I wasn't smart enough to tie my shoes, surrounded by brilliant people within Microsoft at customer sites. And that is the following. You are as smart as they think you are, or you wouldn't be here. And that's a very, very valuable aphorism for me.
There you
okay,
go.
so hope that answer, not pithy like you guys, but I hope it was hope you enjoyed it.
So you've worked with SQL Server for a long time, Jimmy, but if there's one thing you could change about SQL Server, and maybe you did talk about that redo log, but if there's one thing you could change about SQL Server, what would it be?
That would be it right now, the redo log.
Okay.
It's the big bottleneck. It is the thing right now that has the potential to keep SQL Server from actualizing its true capabilities. Now, again, not a lot of people need to hit it right now.
Sure.
But it's limiting us. I can't invest time documenting AG solutions if we have this. A lot of people need to hit it right now.
Sure.
But it's limiting us. I can't invest time documenting AG solutions if we have this bottleneck. If that bottleneck were remediated tomorrow, we would be off to the races and with our various OEMs documenting one availability group solution after another.
Right.
So what's the best piece of career advice you've ever received?
Man, you guys are hammering me. I used to be in grad school. This is a question I've heard before. So I know the answer to this. I used to be in grad school, and great guy, I don't remember his name. We were doing our thing that day, and he, without solicitation, gave me this advice. He says, specialize, find a niche, and dig deep. And that's paid off for me. You've heard similar things maybe from other people, but it's really paid off for me. Some of you may know my original quote-unquote claim to fame was I published the stuff related to disk partition. I was just gobsmacked and couldn't believe this existed, and no one really knew about it. And so I searched for an opportunity to actually do the testing, seized that opportunity, validated it for myself, and we were off to the races. And it was good enough for that is what brought me to the attention of the SQL Cat team, and the SQL Cat team has been an integral and very, very, very valuable part of my success, and put me in a position to be successful at SanDisk, Western Digital, for example, with the Fusion IO people. So specialize, find something, and go for it. Focus on the fundamentals. If you notice, you go to your SQL Saturday sessions, etc. Some of the sessions on fundamentals are some of the most well attended, and it's true. Fundamentals are important. You can't get too much of them. And speaking of those sessions, community. You can't get too much community. And you guys refer to this also too much of them. And speaking of those sessions, community. You can't get too much community. And you guys refer to the SQL family questions. This whole set of questions is based on SQL family. This close-knit group of folks we hang with. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. So we've mentioned a little bit of your background and some of the places that you've been, but give us the nickel tour. How did you actually get started with SQL Server?
Oh my gosh, how deeply I could get in trouble with this answer. Okay, but you said nickel. I was in grad school, went to California, came home a few years later with my tail between my legs, and got a job. I went there. That's the part that get me in trouble. But I got a job way back in the days of Windows 3.1, and I needed to do some. We did everything on paper, and I said we can computerize this. I didn't know anything about computers, but I thought I could figure it out. And the computer that I wanted to use that had Excel on it was always busy. So I went. This other computer didn't have Excel, but it had this thing called Access on it, and I thought, well, that looks close enough to a spreadsheet to me. I'm sure I can. I'm sure I can figure it out. And I had that hard copy manual of Access 3.0. I smuggled it home with me and curled up with it every night. I never slept alone.
Well,
So
Okay, and then
Access
from
was
there-
your gateway to SQL Server.
Yeah, Access was my gateway drug. In fact, I remember the first time I saw SQL Server. I sat down and I thought, "Where's the GUI? What in the world am I supposed to do now?
Yep.
What is this crap?" Okay.
All right. So I think our last question is, if you could have one superhero power, what would it be, and why would you want it?
Oh, I wish I had more charisma. I know. I mean, everybody says I'm a nice guy. Wink.
Yeah.
I need not only my 8 hours. I start turning into Mr. Pumpkin, or after 10 or so. In fact, I went to the Microsoft. I was invited to go to a Microsoft Services holiday party the other night, and I actually had to make an explicit. My friend got an explicit commitment from me that I wouldn't start whining after 9 o'clock. That I would man up. I would man up and hang out until 11. So that's my thing. If I could get by with 6 hours of sleep on a consistent basis instead of 8, I'd be a different man.
There you go. Yeah,
I'm
major
with
feeling
you
of
there.
humankind.
Making it to 11 is much harder than it used to be.
Yeah, but I will say though, related to health is the importance of fitness. I know, Steve, you've lost some weight. Some of you, Carlos, you may know. Carlos, I don't know what your situation is. I've lost 85 pounds 3 different times. Speaking of a yo-yo, roller coaster ride, 3 different times I've gained and lost 85 pounds, and I gained and lost 85 pounds, and I can't tell you how many times I've gained and lost 50 pounds. I finally have gotten myself to a point where I'm relatively stable and healthy, and I make fitness a priority. My claim to fame, I mentioned my my misspent youth a little while ago, where I came back with my tail between my legs. While out there on the left coast, I met Richard Simmons. You guys have heard of Sweating to the Oldies?
Of course.
Oh yeah.
You don't know the story, do you guys? I'm one of the stars. I am one of the primary performers in Richard Simmons' Sweating to the Oldies for the very first one.
Is that right?
Wow.
I swear. I might even send you guys a little clip to post with this.
That would be awesome.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Well, so now you know the real reason we wanted to have you on the show today, Jimmy. So we could get to that little nugget.
So for those of you indefatigable persons who have well, there you go.
Well, so now you know the real reason we wanted to have you on the show today, Jimmy. So we could get to that little nugget.
So for those of you indefatigable persons who have mustered it this long and gotten through my long-winded answers, well, that's what they earn. That's the little Easter egg.
There you go.
Okay.
Well, thanks so much for being with us today, Jimmy. We really appreciate it. It's been good.
It's really been a blast. Thanks so much for the opportunity, guys. Look forward to maybe hooking up again sometime. All right.
Oh,
Of course.
Absolutely.
So you think he's going to send us that video?
I don't know if I want it or not.
Well, there is that.
Yeah.
Even if he sends it, will we watch it? Well, he's claim to fame, right? Outside of the SQL world.
Yep. Oh, yeah. So I know in the introduction I mentioned that every time I've talked, one of the things that I learned that I had never heard of before is the -K startup flag for SQL Server.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And even just looking that up, because I was like, okay, well, let me take a peek at it, and not being there in the documentation online, I thought, okay,
Yep.
we're going into uncharted territory here.
Yep. And I found it after we did that recording. I went and did a little bit of research, and I found it referenced in a couple of Microsoft documents but I couldn't find anything that had specific documentation that said this is how you use it. And
Right.
it just sort of referred to it in a few places. And basically it's -k followed by an integer, which is the number of megabytes per second to write.
There you go.
Like we talked about there as well, which though, don't just blindly turn it on. It's something you want to try out and experiment with before turning it on.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons I love doing these interview-based episodes as well, is because, so this is, I'll rewind even maybe 5 years ago. Jimmy was kind of on my radar. He had spoken at PASS. So if you get involved with Twitter, you kind of see him in some of the conversations with some of the names in the community. And so you're like, okay, well, this guy obviously knows what he's talking about. And so it was interesting to then get his experience to say, well, I was trying to set up these servers and I wasn't getting the storage benchmarks that I wanted. And I had to ask, right? I had to get some help. And I thought, gosh, you know what? Like, I think I put a little bit too much pressure on myself sometimes, where I think I have to know all the answers. And again, this is one of the great things about having a network, a community, a family, in that you can reach out to other people, get their experiences and see how they do it, because things are becoming just too complicated. There's too much out there to really know everything.
Oh yeah, and there's no way that we can know all the answers, but knowing who to turn to when you don't know the answer. No way that we can know all the answers, but knowing who to turn to when you don't know the answer is as valuable as knowing the answer to begin with, almost.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah, I think those white papers that he was referring to, we're going to have links to those on the podcast page, I believe.
Yep. That will be at SQLDataPartners.com/Jimmy.
And definitely some good stuff there. As part of preparing for this, I know I read through and took a look at what he had done there. And wow, if you get everything right in all the configurations, it's amazing the throughput you can get on some pretty, I don't know, not super high-end hardware.
Right.
At least as far as the servers go.
Sure, exactly. Something that could be affordable to a budget for people who are buying their own stuff.
Yep. And I know I see it time and time again where somebody will be having a slow server problem and then they just go and buy a new server has the same issues their original one did, because they don't explore things like, how do I put in flash storage, or how do I speed up my IO, or how do I know how to tune things, instead of point them in the right direction to get those things straightened out. No,
exactly. Yeah, in fact, we had that issue with the client just recently. They moved to a new server, performance was the same. Couldn't quite figure it out.
Yep.
So.
Yep. And after a quick bit of work, we were able to figure it out. And that's what makes the job fun,
Yeah, that's right. Okay, compañeros, I think that's going to do it for us. Thanks for tuning in again to episode 76. If you want to reach out to us, you can use the hashtag SQL Podcast or reach out to us on Twitter. I am at Carlos L. Chacon.
And I am at SQL EMT.
And we'll see you on the SQL Trail.
SQL Data Partners.